Hey, thanks for jumping on with me. This week we've got Clint Campbell. He's the host of the Truth from the Stand podcast. This is one of the longest running and most comprehensive deer hunting podcasts out there. Clint is a wealth of knowledge. I have learned a ton just from listening to him interview other people. He covers all kinds of topics and spectrum around deer hunting on his podcast, and it was a pleasure to have him on. We talked a little bit about this big 200-inch deer that he chased the majority of October and early November. He spent 30 days, about 2 hours away from home, camping in his truck and his trailer, and that's got a really interesting ending. The other things that we talked about and spent a lot of time on were strategies around hunting low-density deer population areas and what you should be doing right now if you didn't fill your tag during the rut. We also talked a lot about what the strategies should look like, or what he does when he does out-of-state hunting, which is something a lot of people are interested in doing, whether you've done it or not. Clint's got a really interesting approach to how he takes on out-of-state hunting. So this was a great episode. I learned a lot. There's really good information in it across a couple of topics that are pretty popular among people out there who are interested in hunting, deer hunting. So I hope you enjoy it. As always, give us a like, and if you can give us a review on Apple Podcasts, that's great. Subscribe to us over on YouTube. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. I know you've got time that you can give anywhere else. So if you're sitting here listening to this podcast, much appreciated on my end. Enjoy it. Clint was a great guy to visit with. Thanks for being here. All right, we've got Clint Campbell on today, the Truth from the Stand man. How you doing today, brother?
Good, buddy. How you doing, man? I appreciate you having me on. How are things in your neck of the woods?
Things are slow in my neck of the woods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They tend to be slow, man. It's we all have these, in the preseason, or the postseason even, we do all of our work and we kind of get ready for the season, and we get so excited for it. And we maybe get delusions of grandeur a little bit. We have this vision in our mind of what the season will look like every year. And look, I've been doing this for a long time and I still do it to myself. You kind of fool yourself and thinking that it's going to be this magical, ride that you're going to go on. But a lot of it is terrible. Like if we're being honest,
Well, I'm glad that somebody like you is saying that, because that's how my season has felt. Like I've had very little, of anything in the area that I hunt. I had, one good buck who showed up for about 2 weeks, who was cruising during the pre-rut, and multiple chances or multiple places where I tried to catch him. I could just never catch him. He only daylighted twice on cameras. And then I went up, last year I went to Southern Illinois and shot a really nice buck on some family property up there. This year it was going to be like 70 degrees at the time that I could go. So I shot over to Missouri, which is about 10 degrees colder, new piece of property that I think is going to probably be a really good piece, but I just didn't know it yet, and I had some smaller bucks come in that I didn't shoot. And the last opportunity I had was the last night I had, I was hunting on, because it got late and I kind of last minute decided to go over to this area, and there was a tripod in the middle of this point of the field where people rifle hunted off of. And I was like, I'm just going to go up here and sit and see if I can see anything. And then maybe I'll hang around tomorrow. Nothing until there was 6 minutes left in light. And so I lower my bow. The minute my bow hits the ground, this big 10-point walks out of the tree line.
Yep. That's the way it happens a lot of the times, man. That, you'll have sits where you're, sitting all day. And even if it's a place where you have high hopes for, I think we all have those places where, in our mind, this, and everything kind of comes together in this spot and it should be really good. And maybe even have intel that it should be. But more often than not, it always happens at the very end, that very last kind of couple minutes of daylight or gray light. And even more so when you're lowering your bow to the ground. I mean, you hear so many stories of guys like that. I've had buddies that have lowered their bow to the ground and then saw the buck coming, had to pull it back up because they just weren't quite out of daylight yet, and then try to get a shot at the deer, but they always kind of seem to have a sixth sense to show up whenever you're just least prepared, if you will. Right.
Yeah.
And
they're good at staying alive.
That's it, man. It's like, especially when you get those older deer, depending on what state you're in. And what age class you're chasing, stuff like that. They don't get to that by being stupid and making poor decisions and stuff like that. And I think a lot of times we give deer way too much credit for being smart. I've had this conversation with some, different buddies. And I used to say that. I used to say like, hey, this deer's really smart. Like he's, really good at evading, this, that, or the other. But the reality is like, they're not a smart animal. Like they don't reason necessarily, right? Like that's not something that they have the capacity to do. I think we say that because it makes us feel better about, about not being able to catch up to them. But what they're really, really good at is they're really, really tuned into their environment. They're really,
instinctual.
Really, and they're really, really observant, right? And maybe observant might even be the wrong word to use, but that's kind of how I kind of contextualize it, I guess, in my mind, is they notice the smallest things that just don't seem right. That, it'd be the equivalent of, someone, you're getting into a tree and you broke this branch when you got into this tree, right? And they walk in and they notice that branch is missing, right? Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that will tip them off, or they'll notice that. And some people might say, well, that seems a little far-fetched, right? Like there's so many branches in the woods. Why would they recognize that this one specifically is out of place? And my response to that would be, well, if someone moved a pillow in your living room, would you notice it? Probably. Yeah. If that pillow has been in the same spot for the past 60 years, and that pillow now was askew when you walked in, you would probably notice it, right?
It's a great point.
It's those types of things that the deer notice. And so, aside from playing the wind and understanding how they want to travel and stuff like that, you have to be mindful that, especially if you're hunting a buck, for example, in an area that he's spends a lot of time in, or that he has intimate knowledge of, so just say like his bedding area, for example, right? You have to not just be mindful of like your entry and your exit and your wind and, noise, and making sure that deer doesn't get a visual of you and stuff like that. But it's also, what does he see or notice around you, and what are you disturbing around him, right? Because those things are the things as well that probably kill a hunt before they ever actually even start.
Yeah, it was interesting, that situation that I had because I was up there and I didn't have a harness or anything on. When I lowered my bow, I dropped the cord because it wasn't, my bow string wasn't attached to anything. And he's just standing there at about 100 yards and he keeps walking forward. Right. And so I'm like, okay, like I'm not just going to watch it. So I climb down off the stand. He watches me the whole time. The minute my feet hit the ground, he just slowly walks into the tree line. Like he knew, like you said, he knew when he was safe. He knew when he wasn't. And like I said, I had 5 minutes, so I tried to put a stalk on him and didn't do anything. It was
those big buggers, man. They don't make a lot of commotion whenever they get out. Unless they're
so
really
quiet.
Unless they are surprised. Right?
Yeah, unless they're scared and take off running.
Right. That's the only time I've ever really had like a big deer just completely like, jump out of his fur and lose his mind and take off. Was that he was caught off guard and he was way too close. Right. But a lot of times, even whenever I've walked up on them, because, like, especially if they're in an area that they're really comfortable in, you can, you hear stories all the time of guys walking up on a good buck and they'll get within 10 yards and all of a sudden, like, I never saw him. He jumped up and was gone. Like, they don't snort. They don't make a lot of noise most of the time. Right. They just kind of do what they got to do to get out of harm's way. And that's it. Right. They don't make a lot of commotion about it. Where a doe will stand there and stomp at you and snort and blow for 10 minutes, it seems like, right?
They have a big fit.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And young deer will too. Right. But, it seems like those more mature deer, it's like, they know when the jig is up, and they just kind of quietly move along. Right. Or, if you get a little too close and you startle them, then it's like, then they blow out. And usually you can hear their antlers kind of kicking through the brush. You can hear like the tick, 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 tick kind of happening. And that's when your heart sinks, because it was a good one.
Yeah. So you referenced something a little bit ago that I want to explore with you a little bit, and that's the mental side of this, right? It's at this point in the year, people either have their tag in their pocket and they're frustrated, or they've already killed a buck either in state or out of state, and they're feeling pretty good, and it's just like, hey, anything that I do now is gravy on top of this, right? Yeah. From my perspective, I'm the first one. I'm super frustrated. I haven't really I haven't pulled my bow back the entire year. Mm-hmm. And so I know that you chased a big 200-inch buck. You lived basically in your truck and your trailer for close to 30 days over the last month. And just recently found out, that buck was not alive anymore. So from a mental perspective, either that situation or situation that a lot of guys are in right now, where they, the season, it's been a ton of work, prep, a ton of work being out there constantly, and they really haven't had any success. How do you deal with that and keep it in perspective and still keep it what it should be? And that's, an amazing experience. Like, right. How have you done that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm still trying to figure it out.
I'm looking for some guidance, Clint. Right, come on, man.
Yeah. No, I think when, if you've been doing this for any length of time, like you've had both versions of these seasons, right? You've had good ones, and you've had ones that didn't break your way, and for me, it's like, the recent past has been both, really. Last year I had my best season ever. I killed a good deer in the middle of October last year in Pennsylvania, in my home state. It was in an area that I really had been wanting to kill a deer in, like, I guess stubbornly, right? Because it was a kayak in spot, and I love using my kayak to kind of get into little hidey holes. And I got beat a couple times in there the previous couple seasons, by decent bucks, and then finally killed one and was able to kayak him out. And so that was awesome. So I was very much in that first boat that you were talking about last year, where killed that buck in my home state. Pennsylvania is high pressure. So it's, public land is challenging in this state, especially where I live. And so I was kind of playing with house money. So when I was leaving to go to the plains, it was almost like I felt really free. Like, almost felt like anything else that happens now is gravy. Right. Yeah. And so I just went out there and let her rip, and ended up, in the second day of that hunt, was on public land, ended up killing a Boone and Crockett deer from the ground, right, in a ghillie jacket and a CRP. And I firmly believe that the success that I had in that out of state trip was partially because, I felt like I was playing with house money, and I didn't have, like, my season was already a success at that point. Like, I didn't have any pressure, if you will, right? Even though that was I think the third year that I had been to that state, had a couple close calls, like the previous years, just couldn't quite seal the deal. Was hunting off the ground exclusively, purposefully, because it was something I wanted to do, and made a lot of mistakes because I hadn't had a lot of experience hunting off the ground prior to that. Pennsylvania, a lot of it's hunting out of a tree. You have some ground set up places if it requires it, like, I'll do it, but it's not like something I do all year, every year. And this state, out of state trip was all ground hunting, all CRP, not really any trees. Right. And so, the previous years I made a ton of mistakes. So last year was very much a redemption year for me. And it felt great. And you fast forward to this year, I'm in that other bucket you talked about, which is, we're sitting here as you and I are talking, getting ready to celebrate Thanksgiving, getting ready to flip the calendar into December, right? The crazy movement of deer season is over that people like to capitalize on in that late October, early to mid-November kind of time frame. So you really are back to, like, the grind of things where food becomes important, right? If you have it for late season, and the deer that you might have been hunting may or may not be dead at this point, if you're hunting a specific deer. And that's the camp that I'm in. You kind of alluded to it earlier. I was on a deer this year that was, from my home state, or any state, to be honest, was a world-class type of animal. Mm-hmm. Like you mentioned, I spent 30 couple days living in my truck and my trailer chasing this deer. Started in the beginning of October 5th, was when we opened. And so that was, I even started before that. I was even in August, I was sleeping in my truck because I was hiking into a specific spot in the morning to get into a tree to check the thermals, because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to get busted with a thermal shift in the morning when the sun came up. Jeez. And so it even started like in August of sleeping in my truck so I could walk in and be set up in a tree that I wanted to hunt with the same, because I timed it to where I knew on this specific Saturday, I was like, I'm going to have a west wind, and I want a west wind. That's really what I want. I'm getting a west wind on Saturday.
What's it going to look like?
Yeah. And there was actually
2 months from now.
Yeah. And there was actually a temp drop too that happened. It was this really weird period in August this year that actually had like cool October type weather for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. Like I actually had to have like a jacket and a base layer on when I got into the tree that morning. Cause I want to say it was like I think it started off at like 50 degrees that morning or something like that. It was pretty cold for that time of year. And so I was going to have about October-ish conditions in the morning, you know what I mean? And so I was like, you know what, let me get into a tree and actually check the thermals. And so I slept in my truck that night, got up at like 5 o'clock in the morning and walked in and got my saddle, climbed the tree to the height that I wanted to climb to, and checked the thermals, And so there was a lot of prep and dedication that kind of went into it. And then the season kind of played out. And, I work remotely, for my job. So, because people are probably like, was this guy not working? Like he hunts like 26 days between like October 5th and like November 17th. Like, is he like, independently wealthy? That's a hard no. I have a job where I work remotely. So I would get up in the mornings, and I would hunt till like 9:30, maybe 10 o'clock, depending on the weather and what I had on my calendar that day. And then I would book it back to like this little cargo trailer. When I say trailer, it's on my YouTube channel if you want to see like how I built it. But I took an old cargo trailer that my grandfather had. He passed away and my grandmother gave it to me, or I bought it from her. And I gutted it and turned it into like a traveling hunting rig, essentially. Mm-hmm. So I could travel and have a place to stay and not incur additional costs to stay in hotel rooms and stuff like that. Trying to make traveling out of state as cheap as I could is really what I was doing. And this place in my home state was a couple hours away, so it kind of worked out. So I have Starlink in it. That was the one like big purchase splurge that I made. Was I spent a couple $100s on Starlink so I could actually set that up and work from my trailer during the day, and then I'd go back out in the afternoon and the evening and hunt again. So that's how I was kind of getting all those days in. And like you mentioned, I spent 30 couple days there, and that big deer got killed. Right. And so now I'm kind of squarely in that camp that you're talking about, which is I still got a tag in my pocket. I didn't go out of state this year because I was, focused on this deer.
You're chasing that big dog.
Yeah. And I'd be lying if I said it, I tried to play it off with some buddies. I was like, it was just a deer. It doesn't, not in the grand scheme of things, it's not important. And it's not, right. Once you kind of get through it, but and my buddy kind of reminded me, he's like, yeah, that's BS, dude. He's like, you slept in your truck for like a month. Like,
I was going to say, it's almost less about the animal as it is about all the effort, time, like everything you put into it, right? Obviously you don't want to lose that deer, but it's all the sacrifice that your family made for you to go do that. It's all the hoops you had to jump through around work to be able to do that. It was like you said, getting up at 4 a.m. to go check thermals 2 months ahead of time. Like it's a thing,
that was the hardest part, right? It wasn't so much the deer. It was, and I never regret spending time in the woods, right? That's the one thing I think that helps you kind of get over stuff like that, mentally, right? It's like, cause that was kind of like your question. I've taken a long way to get there, but it was like, how do you kind of stay in it mentally? And the way I do it is that I never look at time in the woods, whether I'm successful, however you term that. And let's just say for this conversation, that's filling a tag. Like, I don't ever look at it as a waste of time. Every time I'm in the woods, and that was kind of the goal this year, is that with that bigger deer, I knew going into it that, you being a football coach, right? Like, you get this, it's like you play tricks on your mind to make sure to keep yourself kind of motivated to a degree. Right. And so, part of it is that I told myself I was 100% chance that I was going to kill this deer this season. Right. Just like a football team, it'd be like, the Panthers just played the Kansas City Chiefs recently, right? The Panthers going into that game had no earthly, like, in reality, should have had no shot to win that game, but almost pulled it off. Why? Because the whole week they told themselves they were going to win that game. Even though anyone else you talked to would have said there's no chance they're winning that game, right? And that's kind of what you have to do a little bit. You got to play tricks on yourself. But in reality, I knew it was probably like a 50-50 shot. Like, I thought I would see him, and it was just a matter of like, could I be at the right place at the right time to get a chance, right? And so whenever I find out that he's dead, and I don't know how he died, like some hikers found him dead in this area they were hiking that was close to where I was hunting. And how
did you find out about it? If it was hikers and not other hunters, like, how did you find out?
So a couple of my buddies live there. Yeah. A couple of my buddies live there, and they're locals. And they also knew of the deer, and it was like 3 of us that were hunting that deer kind of.
The hikers reported it then?
Yeah. They found him and then and then reported it. And then my buddy got a text message from a friend of his who, it was like that telephone. It's like a friend of a friend of a friend sent this guy, and like, and it makes its rounds, especially, deer of that caliber, people are interested. Right. So that's how ultimately we found out. And then after that, I just kind of think about, it wasn't a lost season, because I think a lot of people would be like, well, that was a lost season. I just spent 30 days chasing that deer, and, et cetera, et cetera. But I kind of looked at it in like the reverse to a degree, which was, what are all the things that I learned or that I gained from chasing this deer that I wouldn't have otherwise? Right. And that was really like a deep understanding of this area, more so than I had previously, because I have had limited time to hunt this area. I've scouted it and had cameras on it for years, but haven't really had a chance to hunt it. And this year I hunted the guts out of it. Chasing a mature animal like that you don't get the chance to do that often, and kind of battle wits with them and understand how they use the timber, how they use the landscape, and then what types of things did that mature deer like and want to spend time in as far as habitat goes. And when I think of going forward, it's like, where do those types of habitats exist in combination together? Right. Because those are also probably areas that mature deer will like to spend time in. Right.
Yeah.
And so it starts to give me a roadmap a little bit for not how do I find another deer like him or to that caliber, but how do I find the type of hunts that I had this year with quality deer, because quality deer are probably going to look for the same types of things he looked for, like as far as like age structure goes and stuff like that. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of how mentally, like I kind of came through the other side. And I did, truthfully, it's like I did take a little time off. Like I haven't hunted at all the past 2 weeks, just because I was like, spent a lot of time away from my family. And so wanted to kind of spend some time with them, spend some time with my daughter, do some Christmas shopping, be a dad and be a husband again for a couple weeks. And then I have a couple of days here at the beginning of December, another target deer that I'm interested in. And I'm going to go give it a rip for him for a couple of days, and see how that shakes out. And so, you lick your wounds, man, you get back on the horse and you ride again. It's really kind of the only way to get over it.
So, to transition into that, I think that's a really good point, right? You've got another target deer, now that you've got to go after. I'd like to ask you a little bit about just low density areas, because there are, not everyone's got that, right? Like I'm a great example. I've got an area that I hunt, and I don't, because I'm a fairly new hunter, I haven't gone out and tried to figure out the public land thing yet, right? I've got about 150 acres that I hunt. But I don't have a target deer. Like I've got some coyotes that have showed up. I've got pigs that have showed up because of all the storms. It's swampy, and I see a few does. I haven't seen any buck older than a year, in 3 or 4 weeks. What are some thought processes, strategies, tactics around low density areas that people could put into place, both in terms of trying to identify or find, a bigger buck if they don't have one on camera, and then just strategies in terms of, as you go, if you've gone through the season and you've had a few show up in the rut but now they're gone, how would you approach that if you were in an area that had a low deer density?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't so much, I think there's 2 different ways to go about this. Like I have another target deer, and it's not every year that I do, right? Because I don't want to give the illusion that I only hunt specific deer every year, and that's not the case. This year is the case because I just happened to have 2 that really kind of piqued my interest, where I was like, man, I'd like to shoot one of these 2. One was more of a late season deer. He shows up kind of later in the year, and he has kind of historically, which is why I didn't hunt him at all in the earlier part of the year. And the deer that I did hunt, had 3 years of intel on him that he was a deer that was around basically all October and then part of November. And then he would kind of split, and then he would show back up late season, but he was always kind of gone for a couple weeks in the middle, in like middle of November to like the beginning of December ish. Right. So I think the first thing is that, it's not necessarily about finding your target deer. It's about finding whatever it is, the experience that you want to have. Right. And so just finding a buck to shoot. Right. I think especially when you're talking about low density areas, finding a target deer or hunting a deer is hard, right? I mean, it's hard regardless, right? But especially in areas where you have low density, because the area that I was hunting,
I would be happy to find any buck right now that's a shooter, like I'm not even looking for a target deer. I'm just like looking for one that is worthy of shooting, that's not a 1-year-old.
Yeah. And that's usually the game that I play. It's like, I like to say I hunt like a coyote. I hunt for opportunity. Right. And so I usually
I
try
like
to
that.
find, I
Never
usually
heard
try
that
to,
one before.
I usually try to find an area that will have a couple decent bucks in it, right? Say 3 or 4. And when I say an area, it's not going to be like a single pinch point or something like that, that I've seen 3 or 4 deer that I would be willing to shoot. It might be, just the area in which I live and all the public pieces that I hunt, which might be 5 or 6 different public pieces, that within those 5 or 6 public pieces, there's 4 or 5 deer that I'll shoot, on any setup, right? If one of them happens to walk by me, right? And that, I think, is a better way to approach, hunting low density areas, just because you're not going to get a lot of opportunity, in those most times. Now, to kind of go back to answer your question more specifically, like how do you find an opportunity might be a better way to kind of categorize it, right?
Yeah.
I think it really depends on what time of year you're talking about. Cause I think,
Let's say it's right now, right? Because people are going to be listening to this.
Yeah.
We're recording this 2 days before Thanksgiving. It'll come out probably like right in a couple of weeks, right at the end of the first week of December, beginning of the second week of December, that kind of thing.
Right.
So, people are post rut. In a lot of states, there's a month to 45 days left in the season.
Right. Yeah. So for me, the difference between what I did this year and what I typically do is that, when you're hunting a single mature deer, they don't often act like the rest of the deer. Right. So a lot of times when you're finding sign and stuff like that, that's probably not where that older age class deer is that you're chasing is going to want to spend time. Right. Because they typically don't like to be around other deer. They're a different, people will say that they're almost like a different species, and they are. They just use the woods differently. If I'm in a low density area this time of year, and I'm not hunting a specific buck, I am paying attention to where like the general deer sign is, because the first step of this, especially in low deer density areas, is just be where the deer want to be, right? And where they show you where they want to be, right? This big piece that I had been hunting and I was hunting this deer on, it hunts a lot like that. I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's low deer density, because Pennsylvania in general has a pretty good deer herd, but there is so much land in this area, in so many places they could be, in that not every kind of section of this public is quality deer habitat, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So they really live in pockets. And that's what I've kind of learned, like when you're hunting big woods or you're hunting areas that have low deer density, is that there's going to be little places where sign is going to pop up and where it's going to be kind of be aggregated. And to me, whenever I'm hunting areas that don't have a lot of deer, that becomes really, really important to me, right? Whereas if you're hunting in an area that has really good deer habitat in general, you're going to probably see sign everywhere, and it becomes a little harder to kind of discern where the important sign is, or where the deer wants to spend the most time, right? You have to kind of go a level deeper, I guess, if you will, right, at that point, because it's not just, though the sign's here, so the deer have to be here at some point. It's more of, okay, the sign's in a lot of places, what time of year is that sign being laid down, and what time of year are deer spending time in that specific area, because they're still not equal. They're just being used at different times of the year. Right.
I think I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think because this is going to play off of what you just said, I think that's one of the things that, if you've, at least for me as a not super experienced hunter, but even talking to people who have done it for a long time, they kind of get stuck into where they think they're supposed to be, right? You've watched them on camera the entire off season. You've hunted them for 2 months in the fall. You've seen them move through these places, and all of a sudden they're not there, right? And so it's kind of like you keep expecting them to show back up. And I guess my question to you is, if you're in that situation where they're not, are you better off to just be out there scouting now versus, continuing to try to hunt those same places with the expectation that they're going to show up at some point if you're there long enough?
Yeah. I mean, so I think it's 6 in one and a half dozen in the other, to be honest. I think one of the most effective ways that I've found to hunt areas that have low deer density and just like big pieces of timber, big tracts of land, because I use big tracts of land as a kind of an analog to low deer density, because the big tracts spread them out. And so even though the density might not be low, it seems low because they have so much room, and they're not kind of congregated into little areas, if you will.
Yeah.
Right.
And mine can be the same way too, right? I've got like 150 acres, but it's surrounded by, whatever, another
Right.
3,000 acres that they can move. It's not like
Right.
they sit there and know where the property line is. They're moving everywhere. So
Right.
it could be the same thing that you're talking about, whether it's public or private, it's the same deal.
Yeah. If you have a private piece that butts up to like a lot of public, it's the same thing. I was just talking to my buddy Justin Wright about this last night, because he was hunting a deer in Illinois that he killed, and it was butted up next to a farm, and we were talking about the people who own that farm. It's like, they got 3,000, 4,000 acres out their back door that's adjacent to their property. Right. It's like, it's the deer don't know that there's a property line. You know what I mean? So places like that, there's three things really. One is, yes, scouting always, right? Like that always works. Like regardless of where you're at, what you're doing, what time of year it is, like that is probably the most important thing you can be doing, especially if you're not seeing deer. The trail camera kind of piece and sign in general, a lot of times, especially trail cameras, if you're using that as like your main data point, you're already probably like several days behind the deer, right? And kind of banking on him coming back through is probably just going to lead to sitting and not seeing anything, right? A lot of people, trail cameras are great tools, and I use the crap out of them, right? But you really start to see, I don't want to say success with trail cameras, but they really become a important piece of like your overall kind of building your strategy when you use them as a tool and not as a crutch, if you will.
Yeah,
right.
That makes sense.
And a lot of people will be like, well, this deer came through, on Tuesday, so I'm going to go sit it. It's like, well, that deer came through on Tuesday, and if it's during the rut, a doe brought him through, and he may never walk back through there again this season. Right. And so for me, it's like using trail cameras, like they become important, especially on places that have low density or that are big. If I run them for multiple years in singular locations, and I start to get some data on the timing of that location for deer in general, right? Because let's just say we're not hunting a specific deer. It's just saying we're trying to hunt a good buck, right? So I'll want to know for 3 years, man, this time of year, it's, November 26th, there's been a good deer that has daylighted in this location this week, for 3 years in a row. Right. And it might be a different deer, but there's a good deer that does it every year, 3 years in a row during this week. Well, that I want to know, because I want to be able to anticipate when a good deer might be there. Right. Like you want to get a step ahead of them, and you want to use your data to try to anticipate where they're going to be. Right.
So basically using cameras more like a catalog of information, an
100%.
aggregate of information.
That's where they're most powerful
versus relying on any kind of like real time data, just because it's not really real time. Like you said,
No.
It's, you see them in real time, but that doesn't dictate what they're doing tomorrow.
Right. Now the difference would be is like, if you check your camera, right, and it's like, man, this deer's daylighted the past 2 days, right? Well, then I'd probably try to hunt it the next day.
Yeah.
Or I wouldn't even leave. I would just set up, what I mean? Like, and be there and stay. And then I would probably hunt it the next day. You know what I mean? Because that deer is showing you a propensity to do something over and over again. And they typically don't do that for an extended period of time. It's usually like a couple of days, and then they're off to like whatever else they're going to do, and so that really, like this time of year, when you get into that kind of post rut, time frame, a couple things start to come into play. Gun seasons in a lot of places come in, right? And so you can start to play off the pressure a little bit. So where are most guys going to be, right? And where are most of them not going to be? Where's the heaviest cover? Like that's a really easy strategy to play. This first week of December, a lot of big deer get killed that week of Thanksgiving and like the first week of December. Especially if like you're in the mountains or you're in like a big woods setting. Like I have a good buddy. He's a killer from Virginia, Nathan Killen. And his favorite time of year to hunt is that first week of December, because that's usually whenever he sees big deer become most visible. And again, I'm kind of referencing big deer, but just good deer in general, we can say, become most visible, because that's really kind of like the second rut time frame, right? So if you imagine that first kind of rut time frame comes in, end of October, first week of November, for example, right? Does get bred, bucks are out looking for does, right? And a lot of times during that time frame, you'll see a lot of the 2 and 3 year olds kind of running crazy. And then it's not
Yeah.
until later in November, beginning of December, like you'll see not as frequently, but all of a sudden, like the bigger deer, more mature deer get visible, right? And part of the reason is because that first group of does gets bred, right? And then there's a
Mhm.
lot lockdown that happens, of course, right?
Mhm.
And then they come out of lockdown, which is basically last week, roughly, right? And the does will cycle, those who weren't bred will cycle back in 30 days after their first estrus state, right? And so if a doe came in on October 30th, roughly around November 30th, she should be back in, right? Or if she came in November 5th, right? Well, then around 5th of December, I know it's not the exact math, but just, rough math, right? That first week of December should be whenever she's back in if she didn't get bred, right? And so that's oftentimes why you'll see those big deer just kind of up zombie walking, because there's groups of does that are coming back in for their second cycle that haven't been bred, and they're trying to find that last doe. And so this is a good kind of time period to find that zombie walking deer, trying to find that last doe, making that last ditch effort to breed, right? Which can be, a successful strategy this time of year if you're in a low deer density area. You find those does, you find where those does are at. If you've run cameras on those doe groups potentially, right, which is something I like to do, you'll know kind of like when that first estrus state is, because you'll see a flurry of buck activity around that doe bedding area. And then if they've not been bred, then 30 days out from that doe group is going to be back into play, right? And so that's another kind of strategy I like to use for those areas where it's going to be real hard for me to catch up to a deer, just in general, trying to figure out maybe where he's bedding or where he's feeding, because maybe like the food is dispersed, right? If it's a big area, he can be bedded anywhere. I'll use those doe groups almost like as magnets and say, all right, I've got these 3 doe groups and I know roughly when their estrus dates are because I've watched them on camera for a couple years. And so I can hunt them in October, November when their first cycle comes in. And then when it comes this time of year and the pickings get a little bit thin, I know I can kind of rotate back through them, because that 30-day cycle, bucks at some point should be kind of making their way back through to check those groups again.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I know you like to travel a lot too, right? Mm-hmm. So that was one of the other things I was going to ask you about, was just when you go to a new area, like one you've never been to before, how do you approach that? What do you do, the first couple days? And I think this is kind of the question is, how long do you scout versus, when do you start hunting? Do you, as soon as you see sign that you like, are you setting up, or do you kind of keep scouting to get a better idea of the total area before you do that? What does that look like, when you go to a new piece of property out of state that you've never been at before?
Right. So it always starts with, me on maps before I get there. Right. Mm-hmm. And I'll kind of have, I'll have some areas kind of marked, that I know that I want to make it to, or that I would like to check out. I'll kind of have like a primary area where I think should be good, and I'll have some kind of backup areas that I'll want to get to. As far as when I actually get there, this is often what I do. It's like most of the time I go in blind, and I rarely ever go to the state, or the piece that I'm going to hunt if I'm traveling out of state, until I get there to actually hunt. For whatever reason, I do better that way, to the point that I should probably adopt that same approach, in my home state. I get a lot more aggressive. I'm probably less patient when I'm on the road. And it's all because I have short time. And so there's something to be said for having to make decisions with like the information that you have, right? I think a lot of times when you hunt your home state, you get inundated with, information and data. If you're running cameras or scouting a lot or whatever the case is,
yep.
To where you start to kind of be a little bit conservative, because you're like, I'm not going to hunt this spot today. I'm going to hunt it in 3 weeks, because that's when I think it should get really good. Where it's like, if you're only there for 10 days, you're like, I'm hunting that spot because I think it's the best spot.
Yeah, I find myself doing that all the time, like worried about whether I'm putting too much pressure on that area. Don't go in there now because I may screw it up, for that cold front that's coming in 6 days. Mm-hmm. All the time I'm doing that.
Yeah. So, a lot of times when I get there, like the first day, for example, it's like I usually don't run in like first thing in the morning. It's like I let the sun come up and I go in with like just a little bit of light, because I want to be able to see, and I don't want to necessarily bump deer, and I kind of make my way to like wherever I'm planning to go. What I do try to do, and it didn't work out so as neatly as this, I guess, earlier on when I was traveling to hunt. It works out a little more so now, just because I've been doing the podcast for a while. I got buddies all over, every state. And so usually I can talk to them and get a qualifier of what type of sign I should be looking for as far as like quality of sign, right? Because I think that that's a big.
It changes by geographical area, the kind of what
It
you're
does,
hunting, where
man.
you're hunting. It's not the same everywhere you go, right?
Yeah, because like the thing is, like, I mean, a scrape is a scrape is a scrape, right? Like that's pretty straightforward, right? But a lot of times what I'm seeing first, because a lot of times my trips are going to be that late October, beginning of November kind of time frame. Yeah, so a lot of what I'm seeing at first are rubs before I'm usually finding scrapes usually. And so I want to kind of get a qualifier of, I'll just give you an example. The deer that I was chasing this year, big woods piece, he was a world-class type of animal. And I got him making a rub on a video on a trail camera. So then I was able to identify his rubs. And that caliber of deer was making a rub that was probably 6 inches long and about 1.5 feet off the ground on a small tree. And he had one unique identifier. You could tell if it was his rub or not. And so I was able to find them, and like none of them were big, right?
He's 200-inch plus deer, and he's making rubs that you would never think that caliber of a deer would be making.
That a forky could make. Yeah.
Right.
And so I had to learn that in that piece, and it was two of my buddies that I've kind of referenced before that I scouted with when I first started scouting that piece to learn and understand what good sign is for that area. Because I just wasn't finding big rubs in that area. I knew there had to be good deer just because of this amount of space that they had to be able to get some age on them. And I just wasn't finding big rubs. And they were like, hey, that's a really good rub. And so now I had context for what I was looking at. Right. So it's the same thing when I go out of state. You go to Iowa or something like that, for example. It's like, and you find like a rub that you think is big for PA, right? It's like, well, no, that's probably a 3-year-old made that. Right. And so you want to start to kind of get some context about where deer like to spend time, what type of habitat do they want to spend time in? What is, where are you finding like your doe groups? Like, is there a certain elevation? If it's mountain ground, is there a certain elevation that the deer like to use that, maybe the soil is different at a certain elevation. So white oaks grow better, in this type of environment versus this type of environment on this piece or whatever the case is. Right. So you try to get a little bit of that context as much as you can before you get there. And then for me, I kind of go in blind and I just start scouting my way into an area that I've predetermined that I wanted to look at. Now, I don't always make it there because if I start finding stuff that I like, and this is what I tell people who are just starting out hunting when they say, they have a hard time, finding deer or whatever the case is. When I go to a new piece, I scout it and work it like I'm a new hunter. Like I don't do anything that's mystical necessarily. It's like if I'm not seeing the sign that I want to see, or I'm not seeing a lot, it's like I will find a deer trail and I will just start walking it. Right. And I will walk it until I start picking something up. And then once I pick something up, that's when I'll start following the sign and figure out, where it's leading me, if it's somewhere where I want to hunt or whatever the case is. Right. And then usually on these out of state trips, it's like as soon as I find hot sign, like, maybe it's a rub that the shavings are still on the ground. It was windy last night. So, the shavings wouldn't be as visible. If they're visible, that means it was something that happened probably in the last like 12-ish hours or so. I'll set up on it and just watch. I find a scrape that looks like it's been tended recently. Maybe the dirt's still a little moist or whatever the case is from being urinated in. Like I'll set up on it, right, and just kind of watch and see what happens. And a lot of times what I'll do on these trips, I'm kind of going through it kind of quick without, making it too boring, because there's a lot to like qualify the what you're seeing, right? It's like if I find like a scrape, it's like, okay, is this scrape a community scrape? Is there a licking branch? Is there not a licking branch? Like not all scrapes are created equal. Is it adjacent to doe bedding? Is this because deer are aggregating here because there's a food source here? Is it in like a white oak flat? Is there like a crop field that's not far away? Like, so I'm trying to qualify like the quality of the signs. It's not just, oh, it's hot, so I'm going to hunt it. It's like, it's hot and it's in an area where I think deer would spend a significant amount of time, right? Typically. And so it's the same thing with rubs. I'm qualifying the rub. Like, is it made when they peeled velvet? Is it fresh right now? Is it a frustration rubs? Are there a bunch of them in this general area where I feel like bucks are spending time, or is it just he was passing through making a rub? And so you're constantly trying to qualify that stuff. But a lot of what I do is I'll find that and I'll set up. And usually what I'll do is I'll want to set up and look at the wind for the next day and know that I can hunt it now, and then I can hunt it the next morning. Right. And so it's like I'll hunt it then because now I know my access for that for the next morning, and I can get in quiet in the dark. Right. And so I'll hunt it that evening. I'll come back the next morning and hunt it. If it's good and I'm seeing deer, I might hunt it and sit all day. If it kind of peters out or whatever the case is, a lot of times I get down, tear down in the middle of the day. I kind of wait. If it's this time of year, or if it's rut, then I'm trying to sit through that like late morning movement, and then I'll get down and move and scout. If it's earlier in the year, let's say like mid-ish October or early October even, man, I sit till like 9:30 and I'm down and I'm scouting the rest of the day, and I probably won't get back into a tree till like 4, and then when it's later in the season, then I kind of follow the same kind of principle as I do early season, where it's like I might hunt the morning, and the morning might just be to get in and watch, and then just to be in the woods to scout, because as you get later in the year, mornings become a little bit more challenging to hunt, just like they are earlier in the year. I love mornings personally, but it can be challenging to hunt, especially if you're trying to set up on like an area that you think they're bedding in, because they're often going to beat you back to bed those times of year. But and then I just leapfrog every set, until I start to find a place where I feel like I'm in the action or I'm consistently seeing deer. And then I'll kind of work that area to like, as much as I possibly can. Right. It's like, if I'm seeing bucks, then I'll stick around. If not, I might kind of tweak it. Maybe the wind's going to change like in the next day or two, and I need to find a different area. And so then I'll do that, but I'll mark that spot as a place whenever I have, whatever wind is good for it. Say it's a north wind. I'm going to come back here on the next north wind I get, and continue to work that spot if I feel good about it. And that's really kind of how I hunt out of state. It's aggressive. I don't worry about bumping deer. I won't say I don't worry about it, but it's not the end all be all for me. I'm willing to bump deer. A lot of times if I'm not finding deer, I will just walk in with the purpose of bumping deer just to know where they're at.
See if you can find them.
Yeah. And then that's how I killed the one deer I killed in Iowa. It's like I literally bumped him out of his bed like the day before. I went up and set up on him on the next evening and shot him.
Same place that you bumped him?
Same spot. Yep.
Yeah. So let me give you a hypothetical. You travel out of state, you've e-scouted an area, kind of like you said. You go in, you do some scouting, you find a pretty fresh scrape. You're near a pinch point between two large wooded areas. There's a lot of ag around it. A big doe bedding group kind of in like a pond, off the ag. Mm-hmm. You go in, you set up, you have encounters, first night and then the second day, second afternoon, but they're all smaller bucks, younger 1-2 year olds. Do you hang around there and with the idea that that's the right place to be, or how long do you keep having encounters with smaller bucks before you go, this isn't, a bigger buck's not going to be in here? Right.
What time of year is it?
Let's say it's middle of November,
Middle of November.
Yeah. 13th through the 20th. Like, rut time.
If I see bucks, like even just small bucks, if they're cruising, and I'm on a doe bedding area, that I feel good about, that has some hot sign outside of it, like a scrape outside of it. Like those are pretty classic. Like for me, at least, those are pretty classic setups for that time of year. I'm not so concerned about the scrape at that time. I like that it's there.
You just like that it's there.
Yeah, because what scrapes will tell you, especially if it has like a licking branch. Like I think a lot of people, they see a scrape and they think, oh, does actually use scrapes more frequently than bucks do. Bucks use them predominantly during a specific time of the year, right? If you find a really, really good scrape that's outside of doe bedding, they will use it all year round, right? Mm-hmm. And bucks will too, occasionally, right? But you'll have does hitting it all year round. And what that really tells you is when you find a scrape like that, has a good looking branch and it looks like it's been there a while, and you're pretty sure it's outside of doe bedding, what that tells you is that is a hub of communication, right? That means scrapes usually exist in places where deer are crossing continuously, or I won't say continuously, but at a good clip. It's not a place that like deer don't ever show up except once a year, right?
Yeah.
It's typically, if it's a good scrape. Now there are certain scrapes that are like frustration scrapes that a buck might make or whatever the case is. But if it's outside doe bedding, if you look, there are probably multiple trails that kind of lead into that general area. They might not lead directly to the scrape, because maybe once they get into that general area, the trails kind of peter out and they start to mill around, let's just say, in that area, right? But it's usually where like multiple things come together. That's why that scrape is there, because it's like the telephone for the deer woods, right?
Yeah.
So now, that time of year, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, if you're in that area and same situation, do you stay in the same tree, or do you would you like bump around in a general, like, no, okay, there's a pinch point there between these two big areas, there's doe bedding around here. Like, do you just hang in the same tree, or do you do you personally move a little bit within the general area?
I'll move a little bit within the general area, but a lot of times I'm watching what the deer are doing. Again, we're focusing on deer in general, not a specific like mature animal.
How are they traveling?
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Because like if I see two deer do something, right, and I'm 60 yards away from where I'm like, hey man, they keep going into that little corner over there. Like I see two of them do it, I'm taking my stuff down and I'm moving 60 yards and going to that corner. Right. Because for whatever reason, especially if I'm out of state and I don't know the place really at all, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to let the deer tell me where they want to be,
Yeah.
and so then I'll tear down and move, over to that little corner because it seems like there's something over there that deer want to be in, right? Or they want to explore, or they want to eat, or they want to bed, or whatever the case is, right? And so I'll bump around in that kind of little area. For the initial setup, what I'm probably looking at is like, I like that scrape's there, but I'm not going to hunt it that time of year because they typically aren't hitting scrapes that time of year. I'm going to hunt off of it. Probably going to hunt closer to that pinch that's going to funnel down like any of the movement, right? And you said there's a pond there. Anywhere where there's diversity of habitat and two types of habitat kind of come together, I'm always going to set up there. Like that's where I'm going to start.
So here's the pond sits out in the middle of the ag. It's not connected to any of the wooded area. But this was the interesting part. There's does everywhere in that pond. Like the pond's got a bunch of switch grass and high grass around it, and there's does everywhere out there. They bed out there, but it's not connected to any of the wooded area. So you for a buck to get out there, he'd have to travel through the field.
Right.
So that was kind of one of the things I was trying to figure out was, do you try to go ground hunt that area, or do you kind of try to set up on somewhere in that wooded area, knowing that the bucks may be cruising, just trying to scent check that area, but they're probably not going to expose themselves during the day in there.
That's what I would set up in the wooded area, knowing that the buck is probably not going to walk out into the open unless he's chasing a doe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I would even probably set up to where I could see that, because I would want to be able to see like how the deer were moving in and out of that, or to it and from it. And if I'm not in the right kind of area, so a lot of times what bucks will do, especially that time of year, and I watched it happen this year, is that, you often will have buck trails and doe trails a lot of times, right? They're not exclusive, but there's something to it, right? Where especially if you look like at an ag field, you'll see heavy beat down trails that kind of go into ag, right? And I know this from like a family farm that I used to hunt years ago. And those trails, like clockwork, does are going to come out on those, and they look like goat paths, right?
Yep.
Very rarely would I see a buck come out on those trails, right? And especially during the rut, those bucks know, I say no, but it's just intuitive how they run the landscape, that those does are coming out of those trails. A buck, like his goal is to breed, but he's also, especially as they get older, is to do it by expending the least amount of energy as they possibly can. Because their first goal in general always is survival, right? And how do you survive? You reduce your calorie expenditure, right? We know that as a human, a buck knows that just by, biology and instinct, right? And so instead of chasing does all around, the easiest way to find if there's a hot doe in the area is if all those trails are running north and south, is for the buck to move east and west across all of them. Because as he's moving east to west across the landscape, he will cross every north and south doe trail that goes into that food source. Right. And so that's, whenever you think about how a buck is going to move in the landscape. So going back to what you were saying, it's like, I'm going to want to watch how those does are coming out, what trail they're using, because that's probably where a buck is going to want to perpendicular that trail where the does are coming through.
Oh, right? That's good. Yeah.
So it's little things like that of like, and so I watched that happen this year. It's like, I was actually scouting for that big deer, and I went to an area where I thought I could kill him. And as I was kind of making my way through, I heard the leaves rustling, and I stopped and I look, and here comes a young buck walking. Now this area, these does are in this area, and they travel out of this one swamp up over this ridge, down over this other side. Right. And they go, I guess it would really be from east to west is how the general deer population is moving. When I say general deer population, it'd be like young bucks, does, whatever the case is. Right.
Okay.
That buck was moving north to south across that whole like ridge, essentially cutting every doe trail that was going up over to go to this bedding area. right? So he was doing exactly what I was saying. There is no reason for him to travel that way. There was nothing up there for him to, there was no food. There was really no bedding in that area. He was literally just cutting that entire ridge north to south to catch every east and west traveling doe that's going to go over that ridge into this bedding area to see if he can cut a hot doe out. And so that's minimizing the amount of movement he has to make, right? And the calorie expenditure he has to make, right? And so that's just another example for how they work smarter, not harder a lot of times. And they don't run quite as crazy as we think they do. It's like we see them when they're running crazy. That's when they're trying to cut a doe out. But when they're looking, right, they're a little bit more calculated, I think, a lot of times than we give them credit for.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great piece. I heard you say somewhere that there are, you've got like a favorite kind of two types of habitat that you love together when you're scouting. Like if you see these two kind of pieces of habitat together, you're kind of like, I'm in a good spot. Mm-hmm. What are those two types of habitat that you love seeing, together as you're scouting?
So it changes. It depends on where I'm at. Okay. Right. And so, what I was mentioning in relationship to hunting this big deer, I'm not going to give out what those habitat pieces were, but, cause it's an
identifier.
It's not an identifier for him, obviously, at this point, but I think it's an identifier for that general area. Like that area. Find those two things. Mm-hmm. But what I will say is this: is like it doesn't matter what the two things are. What deer like, what bucks like, and what especially when you start talking about mature deer like, is they like diversity of habitat, right? And so anytime you have an area that comes together that has two different types of habitat, whether that's a swamp meeting hardwoods, whether that is like a thicket meeting, like just say a clear cut or whatever the case is, right? Like that diversity of habitat kind of converging at that spot is deer like that. It also usually creates some type of edge, right? Whether it's a hard edge, like in the case of like hardwoods and like a clear cut, or like a thicket in a newer clear cut. Or it's a softer edge where it's kind of like a swamp and and it fades from like this like swamp to like this swamp grass into whatever is adjacent to that, right? Like that's a softer edge and it's a little less identifiable, but in the absence of like a hard edge that deer like to use, they'll use that soft edge just as well, right? And so it's less about what is the habitat and more about where do you see that diversity of habitat kind of coming together, because it usually means that there's also some form of food in that general area, browse in that general area too. I think one of the easiest ways to identify it, especially if you're newer and you're just kind of starting out, is anywhere you see water, go to it, check it out, because always around water, you're going to find it's wet, there's water, then there's like what is adjacent to the water, which is usually damp and wet, which is green and usually thick, and then whatever is adjacent to that, right? And so there's usually like 3 layers of diversity that kind of happen there. And it's not a mystery as to why deer like to spend time in those areas. It's because usually they have water, they've got food usually, and they have some form of cover, right? And so when all else fails, especially when I'm traveling, if I'm really kind of stumped and I'm like, man, I'm just not finding what I want to find. If there's a body of water that's around, whether it's a lake, a pond, a creek, like whatever it is, like I will eventually make my way to that, because I know at minimum, when I get to it, if I spend time around it scouting, I'm going to end up finding some sign, probably cut some tracks, probably see some definitive trails, because it gets a little softer there where the trails kind of hold up a little longer. It can be misleading because the sign kind of sticks around a little bit longer in those like wetter areas. But at least it'll give you like your bearings about maybe what direction they're traveling or what direction they might be coming from or whatever the case is. And it becomes a pretty decent starting point. And so it's more about that diversity of habitat kind of coming together than it is about any specific type of habitat that's, connected. And that I think is relative to, where you're hunting, specifically.
And do you feel like those hard edges are a little more reliable? Like, just to give you an example, like there's an area that I hunt sometimes that is a big swampy area. It doesn't have a ton of cover right on the outside of the swamp. It's a swamp, but there's not a ton of cover, and it butts right up against hardwood that's pretty open. So the bedding is more on the edges of the hardwood, but there's not a ton of cover from the swamp to the hardwood. And so I do see them travel kind of right around the edge of the swamp a lot at night, but very little during the day. And so I guess my question is, there's a clear cut where there's like a telephone line that runs that's got a lot of high grass that butts right up against that hardwood and that swamp. And so I guess my question is, are those hard edges more reliable than those softer edges inside if they don't have a ton of cover like that?
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly more defined, right?
Yeah.
And so, hard edges are probably a little bit more reliable in the sense that I think the majority of the deer will probably use the hard edge to a degree as long as the cover's good. But what I'll say is, like, it's also the most obvious to people too.
Yeah.
Right. And so probably going to get most of if you're on public or if it's a permission piece or a private piece that maybe you share with people or whatever, it's also a place that's going to attract like their interest as well. I always kind of think like those soft edges are the gold mines really. Because a lot of times that soft edge is because it's not like here's a timber line and a clear cut. It's like, here's like a thicket and then like a bunch of briars and then there's like the hardwoods, right? And it's that middle ground, which is the place that seems to be the most passable, travelable cover for them, right? It's a little less defined. You don't see it on a map. Fewer people are in there probably, right? Because it's a little less defined. And that's typically like where I find, probably the best daylight movement, if you will, right? Because it just seems like it's a little bit more secluded, right? I feel like those soft edges are. And I think you also, if you're on public, I think you avoid pressure that way to a degree as well, because they're just not as obvious. Like you literally most of the time have to walk it to see it. And then, once you walk it, you realize that you're like, oh man, like they're all over this. Like it's tons of sign here, right? But it's not something that I think would pop out to you on a map a lot of times, unless you're really intimately familiar with that piece and you can see it on the map. That piece I was hunting this year, lots of soft edge. And a lot of it I didn't recognize on the map until I walked it, and then once I walked it, I was like, oh, okay, it's
hard to e-scout that.
Yeah, it is. It all kind of looks homogenous to a degree, right?
Yeah.
And that's again why it's effective, because it's probably not hunted a whole lot because people just don't see it, or don't recognize it, and call it what it is, man. A lot of people are lazy, they won't put the boots on the ground to figure it out. You know what I mean? Like that's the one thing, if you're a hunter and you have some gumption, and you don't mind a little hard work, it's like, you don't need to know everything, it's like you can make up for you can make up for, it's one of those places, I think maybe, I don't want to say in life because it's a little too broad, but it's an area that you can overcome some of your lack of kind of technical, understanding with effort. Right. And that's not always the case. Like if you think of like golf or baseball or jiu-jitsu, right? It's like your effort doesn't necessarily make up for your lack of understanding. Right. But hunting is one of those things where your lack of understanding, you can overcome some of it just by your willingness to walk and spend time, in the woods and putting on miles and stuff like that. All the best hunters I know do that, still. And it's not because they have a lack of understanding. It's because they have a thirst for understanding that is almost unquenchable. Right. And that's, why those guys kill consistently and kill really good deer consistently.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot of great stuff that came out of this, but for me, I think probably the biggest thing that I'm going to take out of this is that area that I've been hunting, that I've kind of got these spots that I think are great spots. I'm going to get back out there and I'm going to hunt that piece of property in some areas that I haven't been and spent a lot of time in, and treat it just like a new piece of property, and I'm not going to worry so much about whether I'm bumping something or whatever. I'm just going to go out and see if I can find, good sign. I think that's a great piece of advice for everybody, that if you're having a slow season or things aren't going the way that you want them to, don't keep hanging your hat on where you think they're supposed to be. Go find out where they are, right? You can't hunt them if they're not there.
Yeah, man. I mean, the kind of my approach is like, you got to kill the deer where they want to be killed. You don't often get to kill them where you want to kill them. Yeah. And I think when you take that approach, you start to see, your encounters go up. The type of deer that you're seeing probably, quality of it probably increase, because you're not so precious on it playing out the way you want it to play out. You're just, you're into the idea of finding them and hunting them down, and once you kind of get to that, then I think things really start to kind of come together.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. Also a great place to wrap up. I've had you for an hour, so I know you've been, as much as you've been gone, you need to, you got stuff to do.
Right.
Tell everybody where they can find you. I mean, you've got one of the best deer hunting podcasts, the Truth from the Stand podcast out there, but just where everybody can find you, on social media, your website, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, appreciate it. Truthfromthestand.com is like where, most of the stuff lives. If, whatever I'm doing, there's a YouTube channel. So if you dig watching podcasts on YouTube, it's Truth from the Stand YouTube. Anywhere you can listen to the podcast, Apple, Spotify, all that nonsense. And then I'm most active on Instagram. That's just Truth from the Stand on Instagram.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I hope you get that second one that you're aiming after, man. I appreciate you being on here, brother.
I appreciate you, man.
Thanks, Clint.
Thanks.
Have a good one. This section of the podcast is brought to you by Osseo Gear. With its one-of-a-kind Raptor camo pattern, Osseo blends seamlessly into the whitetail woods. Osseo's features and technology are designed to fit the unique needs of the bow hunter. With a lifetime warranty, Osseo is designed by bow hunters for bow hunters. Use the code DONOTGO20 to get 20% off any order from the Osseo Gear website. Visit them at OsseoGear.com. Elevate your game with Osseo.